battles of Baghdad, back to our arms, bring them home.
Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors. We've been advocating for peace and justice for over a decade. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Alice Brody. Thank you for being here, Alice.
And thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with a little background about Alice. Alice has traveled to over 50 countries, beginning with the Peace Corps in Nigeria in 1966 during the period of the Biafra War. She was evacuated in the middle of the night, eventually being reassigned to Morogoro, Tanzania. She's been involved in the labor movement since the mid-70s, working at the GM plant in California and Brazil. She was part of the Brotherhood Caucus, a grassroots movement that democratized the union. More recently, she's worked for NYSUT for 16 years, creating a program for teacher aides and assistants. She continues to be an important activist in the Capital Region. Could you talk a little bit about your background, Alice? How long have you been an activist? Why did you decide to become an activist?
Well, there's a running joke in my family about how I was born very, very prematurely, and the doctor said that I really didn't have any chance to make it, and I did, and I came out of the womb fighting. So I think that's where it first began. But I grew up in a working class community. We were what people would have called poor Jews. And issues of race and class were really ingrained through my childhood experience. My father had a job where he was daily in contact with the African American community. And he used to take my sisters and myself during our summers to meet people, to visit them. And every time we went, we would get the same lecture. You're going into a house where the people are very poor. You must treat people with the same respect that you would anybody else. So issues of race were very prevalent. Also, I grew up at a time when, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Mayor Frank Rizzo. He was the police chief then, and he actually lived not far from us. And I got involved, this was when I was in high school, in demonstrations against him because he was very racist, and there were many attacks on blacks in our community. After high school, I went into the Peace Corps. And this was a very formative experience for me, as you mentioned, Trudy, you know, being in Nigeria during the Biafra War, which was truly horrific. Over 1 million people died, and then having to be evacuated in the middle of the night and not seeing my students. I was a high school teacher of biology, and not being able to say goodbye to my students or members of the community. And it turned out that our school was bombed and many of the students had died. So that was something that has remained with me for a lifetime. Then I went to Tanzania, and Tanzania at the time was considered a socialist country, and Julius Nyerere was the president. And in the town that I lived, the African National Congress had its headquarters. And I befriended them, and we became very close. And they were the ones that educated me about colonialism and imperialism. And they gave me many books to read. So by the time I came back to the States, I was really a much changed person. But before I went back, I spent a year traveling alone through the Mideast and Eastern Europe. And at that time, I could travel alone. I didn't wear a head covering. And I went to Sudan, if you can imagine. And I was invited to stay with a family, and the men and women had separate headquarters. And I stayed with the women, and it was a very, very wonderful experience. And the same thing happened to me actually when I went to Egypt. I stayed with a family, although in this family the men and women lived together. From there I spent about a half year working on a kibbutz in Israel, and that is where I had my first experience of occupation, and this was 1969. So I returned home with that knowledge, and it really changed, in many ways, changed my life in some very significant ways. So that's my early life. I would just add that when I came back to the States, I got a teaching job in New York City, and I arrived at the time of the massive demonstrations in my school. Even though I didn't have tenure, I walked out with tenured teachers, not understanding what I was doing, and joined students and teachers from all over Brooklyn. And we demonstrated. This was against the bombing of Cambodia. So that was the beginning of a long-term involvement in anti-war activities. I want to mention, though, one very interesting thing that we did. There was a group of returned Peace Corps volunteers, and many of them had also been radicalized in the Peace Corps, especially those that had been in Central and South America. So we organized a takeover of the Peace Corps building. Now, nothing like this at all could ever happen today, but people got dressed up in suits and professional work clothing and went in and announced that they were taking over the office. It was a huge floor, and told everybody to leave. People left, and then they hung out from this federal building a huge banner that said liberation for the NLF, National Liberation Front. And again, there were no iPhones. There was nothing, but we got word. We had spies around who said that there was a big bus of police officers coming, and everybody scattered out the back door of the federal building while the police came in the front, and nobody got caught. But I thought that was a wonderful thing to do, because Peace Corps never intended itself to radicalize the volunteers, but it ended up doing that for many.
Mm-hmm. Just the experience itself,
yes,
is what radicalized people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I spent a number of years. I was teaching school in New York City, in Washington Heights when parents took over the building,
mm-hmm.
and then in Brooklyn. And all during that time, I guess mainly my main activity was involved in anti-war activism.
Okay, all right. Well, now I want to move on to the present times, because the time goes by really fast.
Okay, got it.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you're working on now. I know one of the big issues that you've worked on for many years is universal health care, single-payer health care, Medicare for all. It's been referred to by, I think, many terms, but can you tell us a little bit about that and why we need it?
Okay, let me just take a second and say why this became a major issue for me. My mother had died at a young age. She had MS, and she really didn't have to die. She was very young, and basically that stayed with me for my adult experience. And my partner had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and died 6 weeks later. And so issues of health and health care became very personal. And I think that's why many people become involved in the single-payer movement, often because they've had a personal experience with the system. Single payer basically means just that, a single payer, that the government would, in the way that they do with Medicare, you pay through your taxes, and yet the delivery system can be private. You can go to any hospital that you want to. You have total, complete choice. It's just the way it's paid. And it also means that everybody is covered, and you're covered from birth. As in Canada and many of the other European countries, the day you're born, you have health care up until the day you die. The insurers aren't involved. This isn't a profit-making system. And one of the things that we've learned about the Affordable Care Act is that, in fact, insurance rates have gone up, the choices are fewer, and the real beneficiaries have been the insurance and pharmaceutical companies. So we would like to join the rest of the world in having a system that really means putting people before profits. So I became involved in 2009 after my partner passed away. And actually, I went to an event and I bumped into Andy Coates. And Andy, Dr. Coates, probably everybody from this area knows who he is, invited me to get involved, which I did. And the focus at that time was on the National Healthcare Bill, H.R. 676. But it eventually shifted after the long, long debate about both the period through the ACA and then the Supreme Court decision that upheld aspects of the ACA. And what happened around the country, there was a sense we never could get anything at the national level. Not now, maybe many years into the future, but focusing on the state. So in about 2010, the movement for New York State single payer, even though there was a movement in the 1990s to do that, and it failed, the effort was taken up again, and many of the people who had been activists in the past got involved, as well as new people. So now in New York, we have a state single payer bill, and the lead sponsor is Assemblyman Richard Godfrey. And hearings have been held across the state, including in the capital region, and particularly with a focus on upstate New York, because that's where the support has been least. And the idea is, the goal is to basically recruit more assembly people and hopefully get a majority in the Senate and have it passed, have it brought to the Summit, voted on, and passed in the Assembly. And with Sheldon Silver taking the lead, and we think there's a good possibility this could happen.
Mm-hmm. So Vermont has already done this,
yes.
Right? So would New York State be the second state to do this? Or are
yes,
there other
we
states?
would. There are
Mm-hmm.
other states,
Mm-hmm.
California, Colorado,
Mm-hmm.
other states involved. Vermont, of course, even though there are still struggles internally and on part the private insurers opposing it, but there is a very, very good chance by 2017 that Vermont will have a full single-payer system, mm-hmm. and that's our goal too in New York.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think we need it? Briefly, why do you think we need single-payer?
We need it because millions of people in this country have no health insurance, have no health coverage, and people die. We are 37th in the world in terms of infant mortality. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and some of our outcomes are very poor in comparison to other countries. This has to be universal. Even under ACA, there are millions of people who cannot get coverage. This includes immigrants or people who came here, from Mexico and other countries. Many people cannot afford the copays and deductibles. And every year, the coverage becomes more expensive. It goes up 5% and then another 5%. And I've actually spoken to workers who have told me that they purchased the policy, but when a member of their family became ill, they could not afford the deductibles and they dropped it. And they could not qualify for Medicaid because they made money above the Medicaid requirement. So also many states in the country have refused to expand Medicaid, and people will die. They'll go to the emergency room, and this is a big financial burden, but they'll go to the emergency room at the end of their lives. And the end-of-life care is the most expensive and the least productive in terms of I'm not talking about the elderly, but I'm talking about the average person who waits until the very end. So this is it's a human right. Healthcare is a human right. It's not a privilege. It should be something that our nation provides to every single person living in the United States. If you go to another country as a visitor, you basically will be able to be fully treated if you are ill without any charges. A Canadian family that came here, and it turned out the woman gave birth prematurely, has bills of $85,000. This is totally, completely outrageous.
Okay, well, there's so many other things we've got to talk about here. I think we'll leave that right where you finished. You, in 2013, you visited the West Bank.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that trip? Why did you go, and what did you learn?
Well, as I said, I became aware of the occupation in 1969, and I felt that I had to go there, and finally the opportunity arrived. I went with a group of folks from Ohio who had a very, very strong movement to educate people about Palestine and the occupation. And whatever I thought I was going to see, it was much, much worse. In fact, the day we arrived, we were staying in this very little small hotel in the old city, and we heard these explosions, and I ran out, and right there in the middle at the old city, in front of the gate, a very small group of Palestinians had been demonstrating, and there were maybe 5 or 6. One person had a microphone. And the police appeared, and they appeared with dogs, and they appeared with horses, and they appeared with military weapons, and they broke it up. And that was the first day I arrived. And we stayed in people's homes. We went throughout the West Bank. We went to Bethlehem. We went to Hebron, which is probably the worst of the worst. And everywhere we went, we traveled on separate roads because the Jewish Israelis have one set of roads, and the Palestinians travel on dirt roads often. In Hebron, the main area, basically the main street, Palestinians are not permitted to walk on it. They have to walk on these stone stairs. So I saw segregation. The military is everywhere. Tear gas is everywhere. The Palestinians, we stayed at this place. It was very, very moving. It was a young man He was a Christian Palestinian, and he set up this haven where people could come, and internationals from all over the world could come and spend time there and work in the fields. And the idea was to and olive trees, to raise olive trees, and to grow fruits and vegetables that then could be given to the Palestinian people. And we visited it, and it was very moving. It was very simple, very difficult conditions because it was high up and it was very cold. And I learned about a half a year ago that the Israelis came and they destroyed the whole place. They basically tore down the buildings, and they plowed in the earth all the olive trees, the gardens, and everything. And this kind of thing happens everywhere and every day. And settlements, you see settlements everywhere. One place we went to, we visited the Bedouin, and the Bedouin live in absolutely primitive conditions. They do not have access to water, so the only water they get is when it rains. They live in its abysmal circumstances. And directly across from this Bedouin community were settlements, beautiful settlements with swimming pools, and even though the Palestinians have access to very, very little water. Many of the settlements, they're expansive. They take over huge areas of Palestinian land. They're very expensive. And the settlers, most of the settlers, come from the United States. They're very, very militant. And so, as a Jew, there aren't words that I can use to describe this. It was very, 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 very painful. On the other hand, there are Jewish Israeli organizations in Israel that fight against the occupation, that help plant olive trees, that basically produce all kinds of research and literature on the occupation and on the settlements. And so that was the hopeful part. But they're small. They're not the majority. Mm-hmm. And it's really up to us in the United States. I belong to a group called Jewish Voices for Peace, which is growing exponentially around the country, to speak out as Jews against colonialism and occupation. And we're not saying, well, two-state versus one-state. That's for the Palestinians and the Israelis to decide. At the same time, we want to educate people about what is really going on and how destructive it is, and how, as Americans, $3 billion a year are sent to Israel to fund its military. And this is really unacceptable, and we should speak out about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got a little more than 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So we'll keep moving.
Yes.
All right. All these issues are so important, and
Yes.
you speak so eloquently about all of them that I think you're going to have to come back and we'll have to talk about them all again. But let's talk a little bit about your trip to Iran. You went to Iran, and then when you came back, you joined the Women Against War's Iran group. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I had always wanted to visit Iran, and this goes back to when I mentioned I was traveling around the world. It has an ancient culture and has a beautiful history. So I became very interested in the country itself, but also about what was happening in terms of these terrible, what do you call them? I can't think of it. Anyway, the way Iran was being treated, both economically and politically. So I read up a great deal on it, and I suggest if anybody wants to understand things, you should go to Stephen Kinzer. He wrote a wonderful book about the overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh. And it was always about oil. So that's the bottom line. It's really about oil. So I went there and I met the most wonderful people in the world. I went with actually one other woman and a guide. And we had a guide and a driver, so we were able to cover a great deal of territory. I learned about the history. It has a 3,000-year-old history. I learned that the earlier kings were very righteous kings. King Cyrus, who introduced the first civil rights document, human rights document, sorry, and met with the Iranian people. It was a cultural tour, and I learned about the history. People don't know, I don't understand why they don't teach about it in our schools, because of the role of Persia in the world, played a very prominent role and still does today in that part of the world. And when I returned, I took probably 1,000 photos. And when I returned, I gave talks to introduce people to the Iranian people and to show them that these are not evil people, that the reason there is a fundamentalist Muslim government grew out of, in fact, the overthrow of Mossadegh and the putting in place of the Shah, who was a dictator and murdered, using his SAVAK organization, murdered tens of thousands of people. So that was you have to go back and learn that history to understand why Iran is where it is today. The Iranian people are not our enemies, they are our friends. Mm-hmm. And it was probably one of the most exciting experiences I've had.
Well, thank you so much, Alice. Believe it or not, we're out of time. I so much appreciate your being here today. We had many more issues to discuss. I want to talk about Ferguson and the protests around that. So you're going to have to come back and join me again. I so much appreciate your being here today.
Thank you. My one regret is I didn't get to talk about the labor movement, but that's sometime in the future.
We'll leave that for our next show. And thank you all.
Thank you for inviting me, Trudy.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you all for joining us. Please join us for future shows where we'll be talking about how the endless wars are affecting our local and our national economies. We'll be talking more about drones and also the criminal injustice system. Thank you very much.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our parents, our children home, from the dust of Afghanistan back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our sons and our daughters home, from the ghettos of Baghdad back to our arms.